Hi, I'm Hope Dector. I'm the creative director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. I'm so happy to be back here, welcoming you to the third workshop in the Building Capacity for Mutual Aid Groups series, presented by Dean Spade and co-sponsored by BCRW, Fireweed Collective, and Survived and Punished New York. Tonight's workshop will focus on skills for abolitionist practice, giving and receiving feedback in mutual aid groups. In addition to the 4 workshops in this series, we are working with Dean to create short video highlights that can serve as tools for folks looking for quick information, addressing issues they're facing in their mutual aid groups. So far, we've released 5 short videos that address issues of burnout, group culture around capacity, horizontal group structures, and internalized cultural messages about work. We'll continue to release these short videos, along with responses to workshop Q&A, and to post them to BCRW's YouTube channel and on social media. I want to offer a few quick notes on accessibility and gratitude, starting with a land acknowledgement. Tonight's event is taking place online, but we are all physically located someplace, and we recognize that all land is Indigenous land. Barnard College is located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Lenape people. In terms of accessibility, you can find a link to access live transcription for this event directly under the video on the BCRW event page or on the YouTube video description. Thank you to Caitlin Morey from Total Caption for providing the live transcription. Our ASL interpreters for tonight's event are Tricia Vasquez and MJ Jones. We're so happy to be working with both of you again, and we're grateful to you for providing this essential service. We are planning for tonight's workshop to take place for 1.5 hours, ending around 8:30 Eastern Time. If you have a question for Dean, you can type it into the YouTube chat. We'll be collecting any questions there for the Q&A that will take place towards the end of the workshop. I also want to thank my coworkers at BCRW for making this workshop series possible, including Elizabeth Castelli, Pam Phillips, Avi Cummings, Miriam Neptune, and especially Sophie Kreitzberg, who is coordinating so much of the work that goes into these events behind the scenes, including managing the visuals and communications during the event. And to BCRW Student Research Assistant, Nilu Cooper, who is working with Sophie behind the scenes tonight. We're so excited to once again be partnering with Fireweed Collective and Survived and Punished New York to bring you these workshops. Huge thanks to both of these amazing organizations, and we encourage everyone to check out their work via the links in the event description. I'm always happy to be introducing Dean Spade, who has been such an amazing long-time collaborative partner for me and has worked with BCRW to create videos and programming on mutual aid, prison abolition, queer liberation, disability justice, and transformative justice. Dean Spade is the author of Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, as well as Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of the Law. Dean teaches at Seattle University School of Law and has been working in social movements to end prisons, borders, poverty, and war for over 2 decades. Welcome, Dean, and thank you for being here to lead this workshop.
Thanks, Hope. Thanks so much to Sophie, to our wonderful ASL interpreters. Tricia, your nails look especially amazing tonight. Happy birthday to Jacqueline, who's in the YouTube chat. Super excited to be here again. I'm joining from Duwamish land, Seattle, Washington, and there's a lot of content tonight that we probably won't make it through. I'm going to try to keep speaking slowly, and we'll just see how far we go, and the rest of it I'll make available for people to engage with on your own. Hope, will you put my slides up? Thanks. Okay. So first thing, a couple things about what I'm doing in terms of access. It's fine to not participate in the interactive polls that I'm going to put up. You'll still be able to hear me talking about them, the results from other participants, or see the results if you're looking at your screen. I'm going to read what's on my slides and describe any images and selections from the polls. So if you're just listening and not looking at a screen, that works too. It's fine to not read the chat. People are putting really interesting things in the chat in these workshops so far, and I won't be able to read all of that out loud, but I am happy to occasionally read things for emphasis. And I think that you can revisit that later if you want to. And it's fine to take breaks, of course, because this is being recorded. So don't worry about it if you have to leave, or it's all going to be available later. So what I'm hoping to get through tonight is, one, to talk a little bit about an abolitionist frame for how we do our work in our mutual aid groups, to talk about some of the causes of conflict that I see in our groups, to talk about some of the conflict prevention methods and structures. And I'll be naming things we've already gone over in prior workshops. So if you weren't there, it might be an indication that some of them are interesting to you to go visit the video and slides. I'm going to talk a bit about specifically the way conflict inside a prison society, like the one we live in, leads us to these two extremes where we either deny that anything bad is happening, or we want to punish and throw people away. I'm going to talk about flakiness and accountability, and we're going to talk together about some of the ways we deal with that. Probably that was the number one question I got from participants who registered for this workshop, is how to deal with the fact that people bail or ghost on tasks in the groups they're part of, and the groups feel under-resourced in terms of enough people power. I want to also note that the fourth workshop, I've changed the topic to it. It's going to focus on how we get new people in our groups and keep them in and make them real co-stewards and bottom liners of things, because that seems to be a recurring theme of something people need, is how do we people up our groups? So that'll be the next workshop in January. And then we're going to talk a bunch about feedback in groups and skills for feedback. So yeah, that's all here. So first, a few things about how I think about what it means to do mutual aid work, trying to act like abolitionists while we do it. One thing, I love this phrase. I think my friend Morgan Bassicus was the first person who told me this phrase, but the idea that we are imperfect people doing imperfect work. The idea that we accept that we're going to all make mistakes, we're learners, other people are going to make mistakes. The work is not going to be up to some extreme standard. We just need to keep doing it and keep shifting and adjusting and learning. Another sort of central idea I think that abolitionists hold as we try to practice is that everybody does harm sometimes and has done harm, and everybody experiences harm or has done harm. So there's no way to be that person who's perfect. There's no way to create a society in which we get rid of all the harm doers. And when we recognize that we all are capable of doing harm and experiencing harm, it becomes obvious that we should deal with harm through repair, through trying to prevent harm, trying to figure out what caused it and how could it not happen again, rather than through trying to identify and punish harm doers. I think a lot of us are very inspired by Danielle Sered's quote, "No one enters violence for the first time by committing it." This is also sometimes talked about as the framework, hurt people hurt people. So most of us, when we do harm, are acting out something that we learned because it was done to us, because we witnessed it, because it's societally accepted or even endorsed. And it changes how we think about harm. Instead of thinking that there are these bad people, we think, how can we make a world in which no one is encouraged to do this, in which no one is vulnerable to this kind of harm? We become pragmatic problem solvers instead of people who are trying to find out who needs to be thrown away next. Another key piece of abolitionist wisdom is that if you do anything with other people, especially if you really care about it, there will be conflict. And as Miriam Kaba says, anything worth doing is done with others. So hopefully we're all doing stuff with other people, because that's what we desperately need. And so probably we're going to get into it sometimes. And for me, it's relieving to think, oh yeah, conflict's just part of it. just because conflict's happening doesn't mean I'm bad or someone else is bad. And can I move away from the idea that somebody must be bad because conflict's happening, and toward the idea that conflict is likely to come up? What do we want to have in place for when it comes up? Fundamental abolitionist idea, no one is disposable. So actually, we have to deal with us. We can't just get rid of us when something's annoying or hurtful. Also, I think that can sometimes be misinterpreted to say we have to let anybody do anything all the time. Actually, we're social beings. We operate in groups that have norms, and we can say, like, harassing people in this meeting in that way is not acceptable, and we want you to stop. We can use our social connections to identify boundaries and limits. And as individuals, we can also have boundaries and limits. I can't do that. I won't do that. I'll only do this much. And it's really important. If we don't feel like we can have them, that can actually cause a lot of conflict and harm. And one of the things abolitionists are always doing is seeking like right-sized responses instead of responses that are extreme, like we're going to get rid of you, or minimizing, like, oh, it's no big deal, it didn't really happen, whoever is upset should stop talking about it, right? We're seeking what's right-sized, what would be like the right way to deal with this that would stop it from happening again and make people, as well as they can be, given that it did happen, and kind of repair and hopefully maybe bring us back together. And I guess at the bottom line is kind of just, we're refusing to punish, shame, or stigmatize. Our society is obsessed with those things as solutions. And it's pretty clear that people don't learn or change in growthful ways when they're being punished, shamed, or stigmatized. Those are just like not acceptable ways, in my opinion. And I think abolitionism holds this to deal with the rough conditions we're all living under. And there are other options. So this is like just a list of things that I think can help us shape an idea of how mutual aid groups might want to move, given that we're going to have conflict. And I offer this because you could, for example, do a brainstorm about this in your group, like as a way to build shared culture. We talked a lot about group culture in a prior session. Can we build some shared understandings about how we want to move when things get hard? And could we even maybe have that conversation before things get really hard? Sometimes you can't. Things are already hard. It's still worth having the conversation. But I think it's kind of amazing when groups can think about their values and practices around conflict before there's something really intense happening. There are many causes of conflicts in groups. Some of the ones I see repeatedly with mutual aid groups I work with and that I'm in and my friends are in. Probably the biggest one is like, or one of the biggest ones is that we're all just coming into it as people from this society. So we replicate the things in this society, like we're bossy or we're sexist and racist and ageist and ableist, and we act in our mutual aid group like the way people act in schools or jobs sometimes, which are like, very exploitative, coercive spaces. And so if we act like that, we are likely to hurt each other. Like we go with what we know. We don't even know we're doing it. We're conditioned. A lot of mutual aid groups get into conflict because people don't really know what's going on in the group, which I frame as a lack of transparency. Like, how did that decision get made? Or where did that money go? Or, why are those two people on that team, but no one else is on that team? Like just, people feeling like, I thought I was part of this group, but I don't really understand something about it. Like lack of transparency can really cause a lot of conflict. We've talked about this a bit in prior sessions. A lot of people have either an overwork tendency or work avoidance tendency or both. A lot of us do some sometimes and some the other. A lot of us think we're always overworking, but we're ignoring how we're sometimes also like procrastinating or flaking. Like a lot of people are doing both these things in one way or another. And people have conflict because they're like, I thought you said you were going to do this, and I'm so mad that now I have to do it for you because you didn't do it. Or somebody is overworking in the group and they're kind of controlling the group through overwork. These are just really, really common tendencies. It's great to like understand them as internalized capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, etc., instead of blaming and hating each other or ourselves for them. They're just so common. Maybe we could have compassion for them and also try to become more self-aware of them. And even talk about them in the group culture, which we did a lot of work on that in session 1. People have a lot of conflict because they're under so much pressure, and there either is real scarcity, like there is like, oh my God, there's only 7 of us and we've got 2 events this week and people are counting on us, real scarcity, or a feeling of scarcity. Like sometimes there's, because we live in a culture that produces scarcity, we can really be motivated by kind of a distorted sense of scarcity. But most of us, when we are under pressure or there's a feeling of scarcity, lose some of our best skills. Like usually I'm patient, but now I'm under all this pressure and I'm so scared this thing is going to fail, and I'm starting to act really impatient with people I'm working with, or I start to act more bossy, or I start to act more flaky, or whatever. So pressure and scarcity, I took this exercise out of the workshop because we just don't have time, but I think it can be really useful in a group to sit down and do this worksheet that I have on my website that I can post a link to later. That's like, what am I like under pressure? And just talk to each other like, what do I do under pressure? Do I disappear? Do I get bossy? Do I hear self-hating thoughts? Do I freeze? Like just even talking to each other about that, so that when you're then with somebody and you're both under pressure, you kind of know each other's habits, you're building self-awareness about your habits or responses, can be really useful. A lot of us lack self-awareness about what social and emotional needs we're trying to get met in the group and how to do that. So like most of us are looking for belonging, safety, connection, a feeling of dignity, creativity. It's cool. It's good to look for these things in our group work. Like groups, like our mutual aid groups should be a space where we get social and emotional needs met with each other. Like that's actually a beautiful space to do that, instead of trying to get them met by like buying things or whatever capitalism is telling us to do. But if I don't know I'm doing that, and I'm acting sideways trying to do that, like I want everyone in here to like me, so I'm taking on way more work than I can actually do, and then I'm flaking, or I want everyone here to think I'm cool, just like if my belonging and safety and dignity needs are kind of running me without me having some awareness and then being able to make choices like, oh yeah, a good way to have that belonging feeling would be to like connect with these people outside of the meeting, or see if we can all have a picnic, but instead I'm trying to make everyone like me better than they like that other person, or just sideways stuff. So some of that can create conflict, or I need everyone here to have a crush on me, or I need, whatever the kinds of things we do that are sideways versions of what are actually like really wholesome, okay needs. Also, there's a lot of conflict avoidance in our culture because conflict is so scary in a culture that punishes people and throws them away and denies harm. So just conflict avoidance itself, like we'll talk about this more, but if I'm so afraid to say, oh, hey, it kind of hurts my feelings when you do that, or hey, it bummed me out when you said you'd be at the meeting, but you didn't come, or, you said you'd be tabling with me on Saturday, but you didn't come. If I can't say those things when they come up, because I'm so afraid of conflict, and then it bubbles up in me, and then more and more I'm like, I hate that person, and I start talking trash about them with the other people in the group, like, and then I blow up at them. Like a lot of times conflict avoidance just leads to like a more severe conflict later. And gossip is part of that, as I mentioned, just like instead of talking to the person directly about what my concern is, talking to everybody else about them, or campaigning to try to get other people to not like them. We have a lot of training in hierarchy or seeing a group as a place to social climb. trying to see who's cool and who's uncool, or who's, devaluing some people and valuing others. That happens a lot inside groups and creates conflict, and also kind of pushes people out and makes groups unwelcoming for new people. And then there's also this piece where a lot of times some people are getting really celebrated for the labor they're doing in a group because it's more visible to people for some reason, like they're giving the speeches or they're showing up with all the food, but then somebody else is like driving everybody around, or supporting everybody around their conflict or whatever. And a lot of that can cause conflict because some people are not being recognized for their contributions. Everything on this list is connected to, constituted by, and magnified by race, gender, age, ability, and other like identities and systems of meaning and control in really complex ways. Like we could tell really complex stories about how each of these things gets iterated by like white people in particular ways, or by older people in particular ways, or can track with masculinity. I think it's important not to be too simplistic about that and be like, white people do it like this or men do it like this, because a lot of times I think there's a lot of reductionism happening around identity in our groups these days that doesn't benefit us, because people are quite complex and nuanced. But we can definitely say there are patterns, and all of our differences inside our groups can be part of how we see each other when the things on this list come up. So just to kind of bottom line what this workshop is about is a couple of big questions. How do we become people who can directly address conflict and who have habits of self-accountability and accountability to others that prevent conflict from building or worsening or tearing apart our groups? Right now, conflict is mostly tearing apart our groups, and it's really intense. So what I mean in this slide by this idea of self-accountability, I'm just talking about whenever self-accountability is when we are able to align our actions with our values. So it's like, I'm actually doing what I mean to do. Like, I believe people should be patient and I'm being patient, or I believe this group should be, fighting white supremacy, and I'm able to enact, those values in how I do it. Self-accountability is not something you arrive at. It's an ongoing process in our lives, like a lifelong process to learn, whoa, my actions were really not aligned with my values just then. And what kind of repair do I need to do? And how would I like to do it differently later? And what did that feel like? Why do I think that happened? And part of this is also about us being able to become aware of where we have tendencies towards over accountability. Like, I'm taking responsibility for a whole bunch of things that I didn't actually do. I'm like, something went wrong. I'm like, oh, must be my fault. Or under accountability, where I'm like backing away and being like, that's for them to deal with, or I had nothing to do with that, when actually I did have a hand in it. I want to just ask Sophie to put in the chat a couple links. Shannon Perez Darby and Kiyomi Fujikawa have some videos that Hope and I made interviewing them about self-accountability that I think are useful. And Shannon Perez Darby has a really great written piece. So there's tons of stuff about self-accountability out there, but these are just two starters if you want to think about it. Shannon and Kiyomi and many other thinkers from transformative justice world have encouraged us all to start with self-accountability. Like, instead of being like, as a person who cares about accountability, my job is to hold bad people accountable, which many people argue isn't actually totally possible. And we can talk about that more if you want to. That if we all worked more on our own self-awareness and aligning our own values and principles, then that would actually get us really far, since we're all harm doers and people who experience harm. And we're also better able to be responsive to conflict and harm in our groups if we've been working on self-accountability for a number of reasons. So we can talk more about all of that, but I just wanted to say, so one big thing we're trying to do is learn how to become people who can actually deal with conflict. And the other thing we're trying to learn how to do is build groups and organizations that can weather the storms of conflict, that can't be destroyed by one person's strong activation. So like, I'm in your group, some stuff goes down and I am like really freaking out. and I want to tear the group down, or I want to tear a certain person in the group down, or I become more interested in how much I hate the other co-founder than I am in the mission of the group anymore. How could we build a group that had such strong practices and principles that I couldn't destroy the organization when I'm having that really hard time, that I would get supported and that the group could continue to do its important work? That is hard. And that is what we're trying to move towards. And a lot of this workshop is about how we co-build skills inside and culture inside our groups that would hopefully help us both become those people and have that kind of durable organization or group. And we'll share this link at the end, but I've made like a template workshop of slides that you could use in your group to talk through a lot of these skills and practice them. And so that potentially you could just do a workshop like this for your group, or anybody could at any time. Okay. And also these slides will be available. So before, soon we're going to get into some of those skills, but I just want to review some of the conflict prevention methods and structures we've talked about in prior workshops. I believe that having horizontal structures in groups, so having groups that don't have a boss or like somebody deciding for everybody else, actually prevents conflict. That having more people have a say in how they do the work and in what our values are makes the group smarter, instead of arbitrarily having one person who decides things for us. And I think people are less likely to stay in a group where they don't get to help decide how the work works. And so I think it's like, also we want to build a society in which people are like active participants and co-stewarding everything. And so when we keep training people to just follow instructions from a leader, we're not really getting there. Part of this is that we can prevent a lot of conflict if we create clear structures in our groups that new people can understand and participate in. So I can show up and be like, oh yeah, if I want to propose that we do the food distribution on Tuesdays, I know how to do that. I know how decisions happen here. I know how to be heard. That can really prevent conflict. Part of this is using consensus decision-making, which the last workshop was about. So creating a way to make decisions where people know how to be heard, everyone's concerns got listened to before we made a decision, and we made a decision that had the most people's wisdom in it. We can prevent conflict by having clear plans. Like, we know we're doing 2 food distributions a month, or we're responding to 7 calls like this per week or whatever. Knowing that, instead of having the situation where I'm part of the group and I'm an overworker and I'm out there promising that we'll show up on Saturdays and Sundays now instead of just Tuesdays, but I didn't ask anyone else in the group, and now people in the group are mad at me because they're exhausted. If we have clear plans that we all agreed to, it's much easier for people to not overpromise the group or bail on things the group agreed to and suddenly switch what we're about. It can really help groups prevent conflict to have political education and anti-oppression skill building. So when we learn together, when we're like, let's do a disability justice training together, let's do a night where we watch a documentary about the history of this kind of tactic and how it's been used in this movement. Like, when we learn together, we are building shared values, we're building shared language and concepts. It can help prevent us from mistreating each other in particular patterned ways, and help, like, I think, build group cohesion around our favorite ideas and motivations. I think a lot of people who registered for this session were like, they had a question like, how do we help move people towards abolition who are in our group for whom it's new? We can't cover that tonight. This isn't as much about abolition as a political aim. It's more about abolitionist practices for conflict in our groups. But that's an example. Like, how do we do political education to build more consensus in the group about particular political values? So that can be a really key one, especially if we want to influence people in our group to think about abolition who are new to it. Facilitation is huge for conflict prevention. We talked about this also in the second session. Can we have meetings where people feel like they were heard? That goes a long way to prevent people from being really like angry or scared or feeling left out. Can people feel like they experienced belonging in the meeting, experienced safety and dignity in the meeting? And, you know, a huge piece, and this is more from the workshop one, was how do we actually intentionally create group culture, including a group culture that embraces conflict, where we've talked about the fact that we're going to try not to be conflict avoidant. We're going to try to give direct feedback. But other aspects of our group culture, like, do we celebrate together? You know, how do we deal with big changes of plans? How do we treat people who are going through a hard time and make sure they feel cared for? Things like that. And then finally, I think it's essential to do skill building about direct communication and feedback. This has probably been the most popular workshop people have asked me to do for their mutual aid groups. And this is the one that I have a template for, and we're going to do some of these pieces of it at the end. Okay, this is an image, right? I know that right now it looks really tiny. It's okay that you can't read this right now. I just wanted to show you the whole poster. It's from a group called CUAV, Communities United Against Violence in San Francisco. They're a really interesting group. They're like probably 30 or 40 years old, doing anti-violence work. And this poster is an image of someone's hand, and they're holding a pendulum. And the pendulum has like 3 spots it's stopping at. And I want to talk about these, but I want to show you the whole poster first, and then I'm going to zoom in. So now I've zoomed in on the part with just these 3 places, and I'm going to read this. It's fine if you can't read this. I'm going to read it. So on the left-hand side where the pendulum is swinging, this poster is about, it's about how we respond to harm. And so on the left-hand side is minimization. This is where in our society we often deny that something happened, or we keep silent around it, you know, like keeping silent around the fact that sexual assault is common, or keeping silent around the fact that racial violence is happening, like that there's societal minimization and lying and saying this isn't really happening. Or victim blaming also happens here, or casting the victim as bad. Right? So these are really common responses. I would say this is the bulk of responses to violence and harm and conflict in our society, is like avoidance, minimization. And the opposite end on the right side of where the pendulum is swinging is when we go to retaliation. And some of the things that CUAB has written here, like gossip and humiliation, exile, right? Like exiling the person who we consider the harm doer, which obviously the prison system and deportation are big examples of that. Blaming the aggressor and saying the aggressor is bad. So these 2 like extremes are the most common ways we deal with conflict and harm in our society. We're either like, it didn't happen, or they're the worst person ever, let's get rid of them. And obviously they're the worst person ever is harder to do. So we mostly do minimization, and then the kind of the rare cases, right? So we can think about like all the people who just get away with all the violence in our society. And then once in a while, one person gets like, you know, heavily punished kind of thing. And then CUAV has talked about the middle path here, that there's a middle path, which is the one we rarely are skilled up to take. The middle path includes being honest with each other, taking responsibility for our actions, having compassion for each other, and more support for everyone involved. So I would say the middle path is like the abolitionist approach to harm and violence. It's like, let's say this is really happening. Let's say we should be able to take responsibility when we do things that aren't right and that we regret or aren't aligned with our values. Let's have compassion for ourselves and each other as people who make mistakes and do harm. And wow, wouldn't everything be so different if everybody had more support? Like when you think about most kinds of violence and harm in our society, if everybody had housing, a lot of it wouldn't, like people wouldn't get hurt as bad by it, or it wouldn't even hurt them at all. If everybody had transportation, if everybody had childcare, if everybody had enough money, like all of these things, right? So I just thought that I saw people from CUAV do this presentation of this poster, I mean, like probably 15 years ago. But I think a lot about that pendulum, you know, and how hard it is to find that middle place. So I just wanted to share it in case the image is useful for anybody else, or the idea of the pendulum. And there's a quote at the top of the poster that's too small to read, so I put it onto this slide by itself, where Kuab says, "Self-defense is whatever we do to survive violence. One way to tell the difference between self-defense and retaliation is to ask, why am I doing this? Is it to get out alive or to get back at someone?" And part of the reason I wanted to share this quote is because we always want to ask, when I'm responding to conflict or harm, am I engaged in punishment or retaliation? Those are very, very common motivations and feelings, and it's not bad to have them, but we don't want them to guide our action. It's not the same as trying to repair, trying to prevent this harm from happening again. And we often each need support when we've been hurt to not have a campaign of retaliation and punishment. And as communities, we need to actually support there being repair rather than retaliation and punishment. And this is not easy, but I just wanted to share that idea. Okay, so I want to just making sure that I'm not missing anything important. Okay, I assume that Hope and Sophie would tell me if I am. So I want to move into this second section where we talk about these two common problems, dominance and flakiness in our work. And last time we were together at this in the second session, we talked about, was it the second time? I think, or maybe it was the first session. We talked about how it's easy to overcommit in our groups. So right now I'm showing a screenshot of a poll we did in that session where I asked people to write down in the poll, what kinds of messages do they hear in their head when they're deciding to overcommit? Because one of the ways in which we fail to have accountability in our work is that we overcommit and we either take on more work than we can do, or we take on work that we do, but it's to our detriment, and we start to like resent other people, or we start to be cranky towards other people in the group, or we start being like, she doesn't do as much as I do. Like these dynamics are really bad for us and our health and well-being, and they're really bad for groups. Like it really, if you resent the work you're doing, it's not good for anybody, you know? So there's something that people say like, resentment is when I take the poison and I expect you to die, which I think is quite funny. And I've felt that way before. So anyway, when I did this poll, what kind of messages do I hear when I'm deciding to overcommit? So this would be kind of often a dominance behavior, but it also could be a flaky behavior because it's like, I said I was going to do this and then I didn't do it. People say stuff on this slide like, it must get done and I'm the only one who can. If I don't do it, no one else will. That's a really common response I get to this question. It's like, it's actually a sign of like non-wellness for the group. If there seems to be only one person who can do it, like that's when we want to go to the question of how can we people up this group more, or shrink this group's work plan a little bit so that no one's put in that position where I have to do something that I really can't do, you know, either well or and keep balance in my life. There's also on here, someone wrote, it's important that it be a Black person there and every other BIPOC person is over capacity. So that kind of feeling of specific pressure on people because they're part of a certain population in the group, that can really like extra burnout people who are already in a target group and already facing like harms and pressure from being in that target group. And now even in our mutual aid group, they're under extra pressure. The reverse of that, someone wrote on this, everyone else is more system impacted than me. So I should do this because I'm not in the target group. And I think both of these, you know, it's just like the solution is not for people to do things they don't have space and time to do. It's likely to not work out if we keep going that way. So that's when we got to say, is our work plan too big, or is our group lacking enough people or lacking certain kinds of people who we want to have more of, so there's not this kind of pressure. Someone wrote, don't let them down. So that is, you know, just this kind of, a lot of us come from a place of I'm not enough. And then we get into a group and we're like, if I volunteer for a lot of tasks, maybe people will think I'm important or good. And when we're motivated by that, like personal devaluation, it can lead us to taking on too much and either flaking or overworking. So I wanted to do a poll together, which Sophie's going to put up. I'm curious people would say, what would make you feel like you could be direct and clear when you cannot take something on? Like how could your group be that would make it more okay to be direct and clear when you cannot take something on? And hopefully everyone can see, and it's in the chat too, that we're doing this at menti.com, and there's a number code to put in. All right, people are saying things like, when I can't be fired for having a boundary. Yeah, it's really helpful being in groups where we're not paid. Ideally, we can act like that. Sometimes in groups where we're not paid, we still act like like we don't have any choices. If I knew someone else could do it, if I knew there would be a solution. Yeah, that's helpful. It can be hard because sometimes we don't know. Sometimes it's like the work isn't going to happen because there's no one to do it. Someone writes, a culture where others have also done this. Yeah, have I seen somebody say, I can't do this? Then maybe it's okay to say that. Someone says it's clear who I say no to. So even knowing what is the structure of this group, where do I give my answer? Knowing I won't be punished for it. Yes, thanks for writing that. Trusting that others would take on the task. When there's a clear opportunity structured into meetings to communicate that. Others offering to do it, systems in place to train others so that's not as much of a difficulty. Yeah, that's a huge one about, can people actually be sharing skills so that it's not like, well, that's the only person who has the passwords to the Instagram, so they have to post all of our decks or whatever. Permission to say no, or options about which parts to take on. If our culture supported loving boundaries and I trusted that others could step up to the work. Yeah. Trust is a lot of this. It's really hard to say yes and no genuinely if we don't trust people. Modeling from others this is acceptable behavior. Having a group dialogue about this exact situation before it arises and making sure everyone is aware that their capacity is important. Yeah, so in that first session we all had together, the video is up on the BCRW website. It's all about how to have conversations about capacity in your group. And I hope that might be helpful for people to then be like, we're all not very good at saying no to each other or whatever. If I felt less like an outsider, yeah, so having more cohesion in the group or feeling belonging can make it safer to say no. Knowing that someone else would not be negatively affected and that it would not be received with negative judgment. Yeah, I want to lift this one up for a second. So a lot of us do mutual aid work where there is profound scarcity in the community. Like there are not enough people supporting people in prison, period. Like most people in prison are isolated, being treated very, very, very badly. It can feel like really scary to ever say no in work where there's so much at stake for some people. And also where people might be mad at you. Like I have definitely had to say no to people who were living with a lot of crisis, and I couldn't do something they wanted, and they were mad at me. So I think one skill for us is like that thing of like, this is a marathon, not a sprint. I'm going to be in this movement, and these crises are going to be happening for probably roughly the rest of my life. And so sometimes I'm going to have to say an unpopular no, or a no that includes someone not getting something they needed. And how do I build enough confidence, integrity, wellness to be able to do that? And I just think there's a lot there. Part of it is if I'm in a group where we've created group culture, acknowledging that, then that will support me when I'm like, I feel so scared to do this, but I need to say no, even though I really wish I could provide this to this person or people. And can I have enough like self-love and self-acceptance and supportive friendship to be like, that person's really mad at me and I'm still an okay person. I did what I needed to do within my principles, and I'm so sad they didn't get what they wanted or needed, and I couldn't provide everything that they wanted or needed, and I have grief around that. Like, this is I just am thinking about so many of you are doing direct support to unhoused people, to people in prison, to people in psych facilities, like people in awful situations that are so unjust. And I see people really severely overwork in those mutual aid groups to the point of illness, exhaustion, conflict because of this impossible situation that we're put in. So I think that's just like a question to be asking ourselves, like, how can I be someone who could say no even under those conditions? Because I know that it's in the interest of my long-term contribution to as many people for as long as possible. Which might mean like, oh, I need a weekend day off, or oh, I'm sick right now and I need to take time away, or whatever it is. So yeah, someone says if there were a lot more people and we had projects systematized in a way that they could carry on without an individual. Yeah. So how do we create teams that meet separately? We talked a lot about this, I think, in the second session, that, where we want to make it so that no one's irreplaceable, like everyone's valued. But if any one person dropped out of the mutual aid group, other people have the keys or the passwords or know how the system works or know the schedule. Sometimes we want to make ourselves indispensable because it feels good to be valued, but we actually don't want to be doing that in mutual aid groups. We want to be making ourselves at least somewhat replaceable and having shared responsibilities and knowledge with everyone. Also, it's good for group culture. Like, so many groups, someone steals all the money and there was like one person who was tracking the money. We can just make that impossible by making sure there's always at least two people tracking the money. There's a lot of good reasons in these systems we live in to have weird stuff happen with money. We don't need to judge people, but we can just prevent it by having multiple people dealing with the money. A shame-free atmosphere that does not place others on pedestals for work they do or do not do. Everyone's work and voice is valued. Yeah. Trying not to have that thing where we brag, like, oh my God, I was up all night making the spreadsheet, like not having a culture of bragging about overwork and devaluing people who aren't doing that much work. It can be really ableist, and also just, toxic, make us all move into our worst overwork habits. Okay, I'm going to move on, even though there's so many great answers here, just because in the interest of time. Okay, let's talk about this poll. What gets in the way of me starting or completing tasks I agree to? So this is the other piece. Like, a lot of us kind of ghost and bail on tasks we agree to in a meeting. So the last conversation was about how to say no when we need to. The other one is how to do the things we've agreed to do. So I'm curious, what gets in the way? Exhaustion from my day job. Yeah, that's really reasonable. Feeling I need to do it perfectly. Yes. Feeling exhausted, relying on other people for some of the pieces. Yeah, like somebody else is flaking or going slow. Yeah. Feeling like I don't know how to do it, feeling like no one will notice if I don't. Yeah, so there's some avoidance feeling in that, like, maybe no one will notice, right? So to me, that's when sometimes we're getting a little lost from like, oh, I love the purpose of this group. I'm going to follow through because I love what this group does and I believe in this liberation we're fighting for, or reduced suffering or whatever. And instead, suddenly I'm like, can I get out of this? Getting overwhelmed from other obligations, feeling like I don't know how to get started, Shame spiral. Oh, I've been there. Live that. Yeah, like shame can stop us from doing things we've agreed to. We're like, I'm definitely going to do it wrong, or I'm already too late, or when we feel like we're bad, it can be hard to feel that initiative, right? Depression, lack of community support, yeah, overwhelmed, feeling overcommitted. Yeah, so thinking about overwhelm and overcommitment too as questions of self-accountability. How can we know when it's happening to us and take steps to change it? Like, how can we not get stuck? I think this is something I talked about when we talked about burnout in a prior session. Sometimes burnout is just like a really general word people put on a feeling, and they're just like, and then I stopped. And so then I was kind of inviting us, can we get more curious? Like, what's the nature of my burnout feeling? What makes it worse? What makes it better? How do I recover from it? What kinds of activities help me recover from it? And which ones further drain me? Like, just how can I take a little bit more of how can I feel more agency in what's difficult about overwhelm or burnout or being overcommitted? Like, how can I say, okay, that's not the end of the story. What do I need to recover? I deserve to try to recover. Maybe I need to clear some of these projects off my plate. Maybe I need to notice if I'm doing too much doom scrolling, or if I'm need to schedule in more rest, or like whatever it is. We're all so different, but kind of asking for the next step. For some people there can be some pride in claiming burnout, and it's just kind of the end of the conversation. But I think we could go further from there. Okay, I'm going to move on back to the slides because there's so much here that is related to what's coming on the next slides. Cool. So I want to talk a little bit about perfectionism and procrastination. Those came up on those poll answers. So most of us live with one or both of these. They can be very related, and we can feel a lot of shame about procrastination. I want to say that for a long time, people would say that I was a perfectionist, and I would be like, no, I'm not. My work is so sloppy. Like, how can anyone who's as like fast and loose with everything as I am, don't even edit this thing before I publish it, like running around wildly doing so many things poorly, how can anyone say I'm a perfectionist? But that was like the joke, right? Like, I actually like believed there was a perfect way to do it, and just that I was constantly failing. That's why I was a perfectionist. But I could not see that. All I could see was how imperfect I was. So I think some of the worst perfectionists don't know they're perfectionists. We think we're just like sloppy messes. There's a lot of perfectionism and rigid judgment in our social movements and in our groups. We're super afraid of being dragged or canceled for making mistakes. So this really pushes us towards perfectionism. Like, a lot of people I know are like, I'm afraid if I talk in the meeting or the group, I'll say something wrong and everyone will hate me. Or I'm afraid if I ever, if I'm afraid if I start or try anything or show myself, that I'll be taken down. And on the one hand, there is some truth to that, right? Like, if we make our contributions that we were born to make towards liberation, sometimes people are not going to like it. And the question is, how do I have some acceptance around that? Like, everybody sometimes gets criticized, especially if they try stuff. And it's worth it to try stuff. And so how could I, instead of having that be like immobilizing that fear, like, how could that be like, oh, wow, this happens to everyone. Okay. Like, look at all the people I admire who some people have criticisms of. If we lift up like our community heroes, Adrienne Marie Brown, Miriam Kabayeh, some people don't like some things in their books or some things they say. Like, I'm so grateful that they took those risks to put those ideas out there. And then also look at how cool it is when they show us what it's like to say, hey, I think I might have been wrong about that, or to apologize or change their minds. Like, and to show us that like learning on the job, learning in public is acceptable. That can, I think, for me, that's soothing to my perfectionism and fear. If I remember people I think are really cool who other people or I have some criticisms of, but I'm still grateful for their contributions. Yeah, it can really impede our boldness if we're like, I've seen this in groups, like I was working with a student group and they had all these really amazing ideas about very disruptive things to do on their campus. but they kept being really perfectionist about whether the right people were in the group and whether it was okay to do this as a group of people that had, was across a lot of racial difference, or if it should be all POC group or whatever. And they just never did any of their bold actions. Like they were waiting for it to be the perfect people doing the perfect work. And it wasn't going to happen because of the context. And so I worry about that we actually fail to act in a timely way, in ways that could make a material difference, because we're waiting for it to be perfect. Perfectionism and procrastination are really different for different people. I just wanted to say that because the messages inside our heads are different, the habits. It's interesting to just talk to each other about what does yours look like, and then to hear about other people's, and then you might be like, oh, I do that too, but I didn't realize that was perfectionism, or I didn't realize that was procrastination. For a lot of us, there's imposter syndrome. Sometimes I think that like almost everybody has imposter syndrome. The feeling that I'm not really supposed to be here and everyone's going to find out that I'm not whatever enough. And so if I don't do it perfectly, they're all going to find out. It's also kind of a shame story, right? Like I'm inherently bad and people are going to find out if I don't constantly hide and cover and work extra hard to hide and cover. It's so heartbreaking, like to see this. It's like so common. I think, just figuring out how can I talk to others about my imposter syndrome and realize they have it too. That can really relieve shame. And find out that it's just a common feeling, and it doesn't need to guide my actions. It might be getting in the way of my self-accountability. It might be causing me to not do things that my values tell me to do. Yeah. For a lot of us, this perfectionism and procrastination can result in difficulty prioritizing tasks. I think I see this in some of your poll answers. I've said yes to a lot of stuff, and now I'm like sitting down on the 3 hours I have between my paid job and my babysitting or my childcare, whatever. And I'm like, wait, what do I do with this time? And I like end up working on the thing that's not the most important, or I just feel like chaotic, like spread really thin. Like, what am I supposed to be doing? A lot of us have like decision fatigue that happens, I think, where I've got 10 different projects, and I even just trying to decide each time I have a half an hour to sit down and work on them, what to do first. I really encourage people to create a prioritized list. If that kind of thing works for you, like, Dean, send out these 2 letters to prisoners today, fill out this form, post this thing to social media, finish this proposal. Like, if I know my prioritized list, then even if I just have a half an hour here, 15 minutes there, 3 hours here, each time I sit down, I don't have to be like, what is it again? It just will save me a lot of that kind of fatigue. So I want to talk a little bit about these 2 feelings that I also see a lot in your poll responses. So most of us, we live in a society with forced work. I talked about this a little bit in the first session. We, it's like work or die, and it's like, or work or be exiled, work and be punished, do your schoolwork or be punished by your parents or teachers, or, work a job or be fired and fear being, dying of poverty, which is a real thing in our society, and being imprisoned because you're poor and all of it. So not surprisingly, we feel avoidant of work. We deep in our hearts, we're like, oh, I have to go there, or school or whatever the obligation is. Oh, I have to do that. Of course. I mean, yeah, it's forced. And so one problem in mutual aid groups is that people are so used to feeling that feeling about work that we also feel it about our unpaid work in mutual aid groups. And it's really hard to heal from that, but it's a really big impediment to the work. And it can lead us to things like resenting others and being like, oh, she doesn't work as much as I do. And, they relate to them. It can make us cranky. It really fuels procrastination. The converse is feeling on purpose. This is what I am trying to cultivate for myself, because I have work avoidant feelings, like I think everybody does, right? So how can I sit down to work on the slides for this workshop and be like, Dean, you're not doing this because of a job at Seattle U that pays your bills. You're doing this because you love people in mutual aid groups and you want to share an offering that may be useful to them. How can I be full of the feeling of purpose and of my love for mutual aid groups while I do this like kind of goofy task of making Google Docs slides and sending links to Hope and Sophie? Like, how can I, or I'm filling out a spreadsheet, or I'm changing diapers, or folding sheets, or doing laundry for people I love, or driving to a faraway place to visit someone in a prison. Like, how can I, no matter how pleasant or unpleasant the task, feel on purpose? And how could feeling that in myself be healing to the part of me that has had work stolen and forced and taken from me? And how could that be part of building a world in which we all are like excitedly taking care of each other because we love each other and care, and the beauty of human flourishing, right? Like, we have to kind of undo what people might call like the alienation caused by working in this coercive system. So I was curious if people would think of a task or type of work you avoid or procrastinate. How does your avoidance feel in your body? And maybe say some things in the chat about that, and I will read some outside. So, like, what um, what is a task or type of work you avoid or procrastinate, and how does it feel in your body? And like when I think about it, I feel like I'm pushing back. I'm like, oh God, get me away from this spreadsheet. Like I feel like a physical distancing. What do you all feel like? Where in your body do you feel avoidance? People say they feel avoidance about laundry and sending mail. Yeah. Overwhelming. Adnan says it feels overwhelming. Is overwhelming like a wave is crashing on you, or you feel um, cold inside and numb, squiggly like a worm? Um, Erica says dread. Robin says, yeah. Anxious in my chest. Maggie says headaches. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. In my head about it. Yep. Shoulders clenched. Yeah. Can't think straight. Yeah. It's like people's brains feel fogged by this avoidance feeling. Anxious and afraid, stomach drop, tension, my stomach hurts, restriction around my rib cage and spikes in my head, dull, shoulders heavy. It's a gray cloud in front of my head for spreadsheets, tight chest for errands. Yeah, I think the more detail we can get about what these feel like, foggy and awkward, Tom says about cooking. Yeah. A solid block where my lungs should be. Oh, wow. Yeah. Um, I can't move. Yeah, I'm sitting in one spot. I want to run away. Feels tight and I continue to wallow. Oh yeah. I mean, I in my head, I call these my workaholic feelings. I'm just like, oh, the doldrums. Like I can't bear to look at the computer. I will tell you all, I feel this a lot less than I used to. It really helped me when I stopped getting paid to do social and movement work, honestly, and had this other job. And then I was like, okay, I'm in all these meetings because I want to. Dean, how do you feel that you want to be here? I am going to this meeting tonight. There are people there that really annoy me, and I want to go because I want this thing to happen or not happen that we're working on, whatever it is. So, like, for me, it's been like years of practicing. I'm remembering I want to be here. I'm here because I want to. So let's talk about that a little bit. Think of what it feels like when you feel on purpose in your work. How does that feel in your body? Let's put that in the chat. What does it feel like to feel on purpose in your body? I want to be here. I believe in what we're doing. Even if parts of it are boring or have like, oh, I have to be on the phone or something I don't love, gratitude and warmth. Someone says, I really feel this flow. I really feel this I feel it as like an upward feeling, like coming from like my center of gravity up through my chest. It's like, I feel like there's like a rod of certainty, in the center of me. Emma says, tingling, excited, sweaty. Ash Meadow says, I can breathe properly. Aim says, like there's a flow of energy coming out of my chest toward the works and other people. Belonging, amazing. When I get in the zone. Easy, a sense of levity and looseness. Yeah, it's so awesome when people can bring humor to oh, let's work on this spreadsheet, you know? Natalie feels airy and connected to my work and others, happy and giddy when I'm doing what I should be doing, walking in my purpose. Christina, like butterflies in my tummy. Tamsin, aligned, jumping up and down and excited, timeless. Feeling good feels like I'm finally awake. Yeah, people talking about awake and alert. So one of my questions is just like, I feel like the like next level skill is how do I, when I feel that foggy dread, my lungs are a block, whatever that feeling is, how do I invoke purpose? Is it thinking about a moment that I loved in this group where we were connected to each other? Is it remembering the vision we have for what we're fighting for? Is it thinking about the people that this mutual aid work will directly reach? Is it just remembering this feeling in my body? Oh yeah, Dean, where's your core in this? You seem really stuck in your head and shoulders. Can I feel my core? Sometimes for me, there's a step where I need to say, oh yeah, Dean, you feel dread. Like I need to kind of be like loving towards you, like, oh yeah, you're tired and you feel some dread. That's okay. What else? Is there some purpose here? Like sometimes I first have to be like nice to the part of me that feels um overwhelmed or avoidant. It's not about stuffing that down, but it's about being like, that might be kind of robbing me of part of my experience. Okay, I'm gonna move us on. I think I'm gonna skip this poll because we're so far behind. But I did have a poll about what helps you organize and prioritize tasks. I think I want to just make sure we get a little bit of time on the feedback. So, as I've mentioned, feedback is difficult, in a prison-centered society. Most of us only have experienced feedback in like really scary high stakes situations, like you're failing at school or you're getting fired or you got bad grades and your parents are physically punishing you or like feedback usually comes in our society from like people on top to people on bottom, and it's like we're really afraid of getting in trouble and being the people who are thrown away. Perfectionism is caused by this. Like when I talk with my students about perfectionism, they often say, I was in a family where second place was called first loser. Or if I didn't get straight A's, my parents punished me. Like people, like, yeah, we are in a society that says like feedback is always bad news. And if you're not perfect, you're in danger. Most of us also are afraid of giving and receiving feedback because we have imposter syndrome. So we're like, all feedback is evidence that I'm bad and don't belong here, or who am I to give feedback? I'm an imposter, or if I give feedback, that person will feel like an imposter. Feedback is really scary because we live under these intense power dynamics of racism, ageism, ableism, sexism, etc. So like it can be really scary to give and receive feedback across those differences. And there are always some of those differences at play. So that can kind of make us like afraid to give it, or some people give too much, like men who constantly want to correct women and offer explanations, or older people who are doing that to younger people all the time. Most of us have almost no practice giving and receiving feedback in growthful and positive ways. Like we've just been in these crappy situations that I'm describing. But feedback is an essential abolitionist skill. It prevents conflict because we don't build up all of our frustration and then gossip or blow up. It builds safety because we're actually like co-creating conditions we need to be safer. It builds dignity. Like I have enough dignity that I'm allowed to share what I'm concerned about. And I have enough dignity that I can hear what you're concerned about. Like an ideal situation, both people can feel both people's dignity while giving and receiving feedback, instead of I'm stomping on you or I'm feeling stomped on because you're saying, Dean, this isn't working for me or something. And it builds belonging. It's like people care about me being here, so they want to help me learn how to do this well. People care how this is impacting me, so they want to hear my feedback. One text I read described 3 types of feedback. I thought it was kind of interesting. Appreciation, great kind of feedback that we love to give in our groups. Coaching, like, "Oh, yeah, here's a better way to organize the spreadsheet that we've found," or, "Here's an easier way to get people to schedule together," or, "Here's a easier way to fold up that burrito," whatever we're doing. And evaluation, which is sometimes more or less relevant in mutual aid groups, but it's most relevant where like there's some kind of mentoring going on. Like I know how to, um, you know, run this computer program or fix these cars or some kind of like skilled thing. And someone else, I'm teaching it to someone who's learning it. And so we can say like, okay, are they ready to do this on their own yet? That's a type of evaluation. Or are they ready to teach others? Like where we actually are recognizing that some people have developed competencies in particular skills and others don't. And so we want to say like, hey, here's where you stand. Like, I think if you do 2 more sessions shadowing me will be good, or we're realizing you're going to need another 6 months of this training to be ready to do it on your own or whatever. The reason that matters, those types, is because it's really helpful to know what you're asking for and giving, right? Like I'm thinking about a time when I made a video and I was really excited and nervous about it, and I'd worked really hard on it, and I showed it to my friend who was like a real filmmaker, and I was basically just asking for like appreciation. It was too late to make further edits, and the person gave me a detailed breakdown of everything they would change, and it was really devastating. And so if I'd been a little clearer about what I was asking for, and maybe they'd been a little clearer about what I was asking for, what they wanted to give, it would have been more useful. So just these are just some phrases that could help us. Like right now, I could use some words of encouragement. Can you help me figure out how to do this better? I'm open to hearing how you think this could go better. I need more direction on this. Can I share an idea about what might help here? Like, can I offer coaching? Can I share an assessment? Like that's a way that I might say like, yeah, I think that you could use 2 more sessions co-facilitating before you run that training by yourself or something like that. I want to tell you how grateful I am for this work. Like, are you open to hearing that right now? So, I want us to spend a moment. Actually, I'm not going to actually give us time for this right now, but this will be in the slides. And if you look at the slide deck I created, that's for working with your own groups. You can do these as pair and shares, like remembering a time when you got feedback that helped you grow and change, and then the people share why did it work. Remembering a time when you got feedback that you didn't want or couldn't take in or wasn't grounded or didn't work for you, like why? Why didn't it work? So we're trying to remember experiences of good and not helpful receiving, and then also good and not helpful giving. What's a time when you gave feedback and it didn't go well? And what's a time when you gave feedback that you think was heard and made a positive impact? What went well? So I think you all probably know some of this. So let's just do these polls quickly. Um, maybe Sophie can put up the first poll. How do I like to get feedback? And let's just take a moment together and see how people like to get feedback. As explicitly as possible, constructive, kind, clear, honest. When I ask for it, people want the feedback directly. They want it from a comrade. They want it with respect. They like it in a small group. They like it from a place of belonging. Somebody likes it written down, ideally. They like it with humility, with affirmation, acknowledging effort. They like it to be encouraging. Shortly after an incident, they like it with empathy. They like it where they can see the intent. Direct is the biggest thing that's coming up on this word picture. People really want it to be direct and constructive. I want to say a couple things about what I'm seeing. One is like, it's so great to know what you prefer. It's so great to know, like, I love feedback in writing, but we can't guarantee that's going to happen. So, how to both maybe share preferences with people you work with a lot. Like, I love to get feedback in writing, but also not become rigid about it. We want to be capable of receiving feedback in lots of ways because it's going to come in a lot of ways. Similar with wanting it to be shortly after the incident. It would be great if people knew how to give feedback right away, but we all know sometimes we can't, right? Sometimes we're like, it took me a month of thinking about it to understand what was so hard for me about that conversation with you. And now I want to talk about it. And it'd be great for the person to be open to hearing that then anyway, right? So, how to both know what you like and share that with your people, like your housemates, your dates, your family members, the people in your mutual aid group, because they might help them do a better job of giving you feedback you want to hear. And also how to become flexible feels really important. All right, let's go to the second poll, Sophie, if you don't mind. How do I not like to get feedback? Partly, I wanted you all also just to see each other's answers to this. We are not the same as each other. Different things work and don't work for people. And it's helpful whenever we can remember that we're not the same. So it's nice to like see, like some people love to get it in writing, other people don't. Some people love to get it at the same time where the thing happened. Other people want time in between. How do people not like to get feedback? Impatiently, unclear, blaming, superior, at the last minute, passive aggressive, angry, in front of others. Yeah, a lot of people, it's really hard when it's in front of others. That's it comes up a lot. Dismissive, demeaning, backhanded, loud, mean, from gossip, no discussion, condescending, talking over me, blaming. Yeah. Yeah, it's like we want to be able to have dignity even while we're learning. People don't like to be accused. These are great answers. When it's lacking a solution, it's harder to get feedback when you're like, but what could I have done differently? And it's not clear. But sometimes people can't share that with you or don't know. Yeah, without empathy. Yeah, great. Great. So I want us to move towards a Q&A period because I know we're short on time and we never have enough time for Q&A. So let's move away from this poll maybe. Thank you. And I am going to make it so that I can see the chat where Sophie has been placing some of your questions for me. So I'm going to look at some of these and answer them. What kinds of questions do you recommend to ask new potential recruits for our mutual aid groups to get their understanding of abolition? Wanted to clarify that I mean this is a vetting process. What I mean is in a vetting process. How can we make sure we're asking the right questions? Yeah, that is a great question for the next workshop. But also I think abolition is a very new concept for a lot of people. I think one way to talk to people about it is to say, this is what this means for our group. We have these beliefs about why our group doesn't work with the police, or these beliefs about why we like oppose the building of all new carceral structures, even if the cops and elected say they're good for women or whatever it is, like whatever is the kind of like crux of where it comes up in your work and where you are. I would have the conversation with those kinds of specifics and not in the abstract. Like abolition as an abstract concept doesn't mean a lot to most people. It's like, where is this likely to come up for this group, and maybe where has it come up, and sharing some of those scenarios to see if this person, is a good fit and could live with this. And I think it's important that people not be required to already agree with everything we're doing, but are like, yeah, I do want to join a group where you all, that's the position you took, or that's the conversation you had. Like, yeah, I want to try this out. I'm thinking about this too. in terms of vetting, so that it's not like you can only join us if you're already just like us, but we're like putting on the surface, this is what we're about. And so that you can make sure it's a good match for you. Because it is, I think, hard when abolitionist groups hide some of that politics and then people come in and there's a big conflict about that difference. So putting it on the surface, being like, you don't need to agree with all of this right now, but this is what the group you're joining has been about. We can talk more about that next time for sure. Yeah. Someone asks, what do we do in a group when a group member commits sexual assault? Obviously, this is, huge. Sexual harassment, sexual assault are, probably some of the biggest conflicts that happen, produced really huge conflicts in our groups. There's a long history in left groups of minimization of sexual harassment and sexual assault that we do not want to keep going, of people being silenced about what happened, especially when like someone in leadership is the person doing this to people. I want to direct people to a few resources. Maybe Sophie can put in the chat. There's a new workbook called In It Together that Interrupting Criminalization put out with Dragonfly that is about conflict in groups that might be useful for some of these questions. There's a workbook about conflict that's about conflict between individuals and groups that that Sophie's also putting in the chat. And then there's a lot of other resources at transformharm.org. There's just a lot of workbooks coming out right now about conflict, and which is so wonderful. So I want to put those in there. I think that there's a lot of examples of groups using community accountability or transformative justice processes when sexual assault is occurring in a group or in a community. I would recommend studying those. There's so many resources about that, and Transform Harm is the right place to start. But fundamentally, the question is, how do you stop this from happening again? How does the person who's doing this like get whatever pressure and feedback and resources they need to not do it again? How do the person or people who've been impacted get support to be as well as they can possibly be, given that this has happened, right? We can't make it not have happened, but how do we make sure they aren't marginalized or isolated out of the group or out of the community? And how do we figure out, are there practices that the whole community could be doing to make this less likely to happen again between any people in this community? Like, were there some things we were doing that made this more likely, like the way we partied or the way we did transportation or the way we talked about sex and gender in our community, or, so many things. I'm just looking at these questions. Yeah, and so someone else asked about sexual harassment in someone's past harms related to sexual harassment coming up in a group where people are in disparate locations and have various degrees of restorative and transformative justice experience. I think that probably the top recommendation I would have in groups is, can we do training and co-mutual education about toxic masculinity, sexual harassment, consent, and transformative justice? And how will that resource any conversations we want to have about accusations that someone has previously or is currently doing this to people? Like, the more we can build up everybody's shared skill sets, the more we can deal with this and prevent it and stop it. So that's like really like, just anytime we're starting a group. I think I've mentioned this in prior sessions, but our tendency in a mutual aid group is to just focus on how many meals can we get out or how many people can we reach. Like, we really focus on the external outcomes, and we really under resource, like, what is it like in this group? And what do people need to be able to work well together? And these workshops are about like bring some attention to how we do the work and how we build the people doing the work so that we can not completely fall apart over these same patterned conflicts that happen again and again and again. So I think my first step on that would be like, can we skill people up on those things? And part of that is about, can we have real conversations about the differences between like punishment and retaliation and repair, and self-accountability, so that people start to build some shared values around not using punishment and retaliation as the ethic of the group when things are hard and people are in conflict. Because, for example, if we're in a cultural norm of punishment and retaliation, and two of us are fighting, people will join teams. And maybe I'll be campaigning to say, look at how awful that person is, join my side. If we move away from that frame and people value repair, then when I go and try to campaign against this person in the group, people might say, yeah, Dean, I'm wondering if what would you ever be willing to, work to try to build repair with that person? Or, I actually feel some compassion for that person, and this is why. Or, just people might not just join my retaliation campaign, but instead might help me find a reparative track, right? So the more we all have those skills and ideas together, the less fuel that retaliation will have. Someone asks, how does a member who's overworked ask to give up a task? In my workplace, letting go of a task is not culturally allowed. Yeah, so in a workplace where we are coerced into doing whatever the boss says, we often can't say no, which is so fucked. Like, wow, and so obviously, if we're in workplaces like that, I recommend organizing as the approach, right? Organizing to change the culture, finding other coworkers who feel also like it's not the right approach and pushing back. In our mutual aid groups, we really want to create a different approach, which is that, accountability means don't take on more than I can do. And if I did, or something changes, like I get sick or whatever, I can say, hey, y'all, I said I would do this, but I can't. And can anyone, do this instead? Or can we change the plan? Like, instead of just disappearing because I'm full of shame that I can't do it. And I said I would. Okay, somebody asks, what strategies do folks use to balance engagement/stress with peer organizations who approach every ask as an all caps urgent? And that's not saying the need isn't dire, but when everything is an emergency, burnout is guaranteed. Yes, this is very common. I realize we should stop, but I'll just say that I think one thing is just within our own groups, being willing to notice, wow, our this other group does this. How do we want to deal with it? And then maybe also initiate a conversation with the other group, like, we don't have capacity to do all of your requests, and we're sometimes confused because each one is marked as urgent. Is there a way you'd like us to interpret your requests? Like, relationally, I wouldn't just write that in an email. I'd be like, can we have some time together on Zoom or in person, whatever is appropriate to your situation? But like building some relationship, because probably it's not going that well for them if they're feeling that way too. So it might be like supportive to say, but at the very least, it's just pragmatic. Like, how do you want us to read these? Like, we want to help, but this isn't like, we can't discern what's important. Okay, I realize we're out of time, so I'm going to let Hope take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Dean. That was really amazing. You got through so much of it. I know there was so much more you want to talk about, and thankfully we have another workshop coming up in January. So I hope folks will sign up.
Well, Sophie, will you put the link to the workshop template in the chat if you haven't already? The one for other people to use in their groups things.
The slideshow, yeah. That's also, those links are all up on the YouTube page and on the event page too. So you can always access them there. I want to say thanks again to Dean. Thank you to MJ and Trisha and Caitlin and to Sophie. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for all the people who have been putting such great comments and questions in the chat. I know we couldn't get to all of them, but we hope you all join us again in January. All right, have a good night.